Every startup begins in a gray zone, not illegal, but undefined, not protected, but unnoticed. In the early days, founders move fast because they can. Regulation feels distant, abstract, designed for incumbents with compliance teams and legal budgets. Growth, at this stage, feels like pure momentum. Product improves, users arrive, revenue follows. But as books on startup scaling quietly warn, regulation does not appear suddenly. It arrives gradually, then all at once. The most dangerous moment for a growing startup is not when regulation is strict, it is when regulation is unclear. Ambiguity creates false confidence. Founders assume silence means permission. They interpret lack of enforcement as approval. But history shows a different pattern. Regulators move slowly, then decisively. By the time attention arrives, the cost of adjustment is far higher than the cost of early awareness. The startups that survive are not those that avoid regulation, but those that learn to anticipate it. One of the first lessons legal case studies reveal is that regulation scales differently than technology. Code can be rewritten overnight. Legal exposure compounds silently. A single decision made early, how data is stored, how users are onboarded, how revenue is classified, can determine years of liability later. Founders often underestimate this asymmetry. They optimize for speed without realizing they are also locking in legal assumptions that become harder to unwind with growth. Another recurring insight is that regulation is rarely about stopping innovation. It is about allocating responsibility. Consumer protection, data privacy, financial stability, workplace safety. These frameworks exist because past failures caused harm at scale. Startups that frame regulation as hostility miss the point. The books emphasize that regulation is society's way of asking a simple question: who bears the risk when things go wrong? As startups expand, their legal identity evolves. A side project becomes a company becomes an employer becomes a market participant with duties to customers, partners, and the public. Each transition brings new obligations. Employment law replaces informal agreements. Data protection laws replace casual data collection. Tax compliance replaces ad hoc accounting. Founders who fail to recognize these transitions early experience regulatory shock later. One of the most common mistakes growing startups make is delaying legal investment until something breaks. The literature is filled with examples of companies that treated legal counsel as emergency response rather than infrastructure. By the time lawsuits, audits, or regulatory inquiries appear, leverage is gone. Costs multiply, decisions narrow. In contrast, startups that integrate legal thinking early retain flexibility. They design products, contracts, and processes with optionality in mind. Another important theme is jurisdictional complexity. Digital startups often operate globally before they think globally. A product launched in one country quietly acquires users in dozens more. Each jurisdiction brings different rules on data, payments, advertising, labor. Books show that regulatory risk accelerates when founders assume borders are irrelevant. Geography may be invisible to users, but it is never invisible to regulators. Regulation also shapes fundraising in ways founders often overlook. Investors perform legal diligence, not just to avoid risk, but to assess maturity. A startup that ignores compliance signals short-term thinking. One that understands its regulatory landscape signals durability. The books highlight that many funding rounds fail not because of product weakness, but because unresolved legal exposure scares capital away. Legal clarity becomes a competitive advantage in capital markets. Another subtle insight emerges around timing. The goal is not to be fully compliant with every possible regulation from day one that would paralyze innovation. The goal is to know which regulations will matter when. Smart founders sequence compliance. They identify thresholds that trigger new obligations. Headcount, revenue, user data volume, geographic expansion. This staged approach allows startups to grow without stepping blindly into traps. The relationship between startups and regulators also evolves over time. Early on, interaction is minimal. Later, it becomes unavoidable. Books show that startups that treat regulators as adversaries create friction that slows everything else. Those that engage transparently often find surprising flexibility. Regulators, contrary to stereotype, prefer cooperation to enforcement. Startups that communicate early shape interpretation. Those that hide invite scrutiny. Another powerful lesson concerns internal culture. Compliance is not just a legal function, it is a behavioral one. Policies mean nothing if incentives encourage cutting corners. The books emphasize that legal failures often originate in culture, not contracts. Growth pressure, unrealistic targets, and ambiguous accountability create environments where rules are bent quietly until they snap publicly. Sustainable startups align growth with compliance, rather than pitting them against each other. As companies approach scale, regulation stops being a constraint and starts becoming a moat. Barriers to entry rise. Complexity discourages smaller competitors. Startups that invested early in legal infrastructure move faster because they are not constantly reacting. This inversion, where regulation shifts from burden to advantage, is a recurring pattern in mature companies that survived early chaos. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of regulatory navigation is mindset. Founders who see law as a static checklist struggle. Those who see it as a dynamic system adapt. Regulations change, interpretations evolve. Enforcement priorities shift. The books show that legal literacy, not legal expertise, but awareness, becomes a leadership skill. Founders do not need to be lawyers, but they must understand how law shapes strategy. As these lessons accumulate, regulation stops feeling external. It becomes part of the operating environment, like markets or technology. Startups that accept this reality, early design businesses that can flex without breaking. They grow with fewer shocks, fewer crises, and fewer existential threats triggered by avoidable legal blind spots. And this is where the story begins to sharpen. Because once founders understand that regulation is not something to dodge, but something to navigate deliberately, the question changes. It is no longer, how do we stay out of trouble, but how do we grow in a way that remains legitimate, defensible, and trusted at scale? It is at this point, where legal awareness intersects with strategic maturity, that regulation transforms from an obstacle into a framework for sustainable growth, setting the stage for the deeper choices that determine whether a startup merely survives scrutiny or emerges stronger because of it. As the path forward narrows, responsibilities deepen, and the company learns to move confidently within rules it once ignored, unfolding carefully and strategically. Like unfolding carefully and strategically, like a river learning the shape of its banks rather than fighting them. And this is where regulation reveals its true role, not as a threat to innovation, but as a test of whether a startup is ready to become something that lasts. In the second half of the regulatory journey, legal issues stop being hypothetical and start becoming operational. Contracts are no longer templates. Policies are no longer optional. Decisions carry precedent. Books that follow startups through audits, investigations, and public scrutiny show that this is the moment where improvisation fails and intentional design takes over. Regulation does not punish speed, it punishes carelessness. One of the most important shifts that occurs at this stage is the move from reactive compliance to proactive governance. Startups that mature successfully stop asking lawyers to fix problems after they appear. Instead, legal thinking moves upstream into product design, pricing models, hiring plans, and data architecture. This integration reduces friction because it prevents rework. The law becomes part of how the company thinks, not an external force it resents. Another critical insight that emerges is the role of documentation. In fast-growing startups, knowledge often lives in people's heads, but regulators do not audit intentions, they audit records. Policies, logs, consent flows, contracts, and decision trails become evidence of seriousness. The books emphasize that documentation is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is institutional memory. When leadership changes or crises hit, documented decisions protect the company from itself. As startups scale, enforcement risk also changes shape. Early enforcement is often informal warnings, inquiries, requests for clarification. Later enforcement becomes public and consequential. Fines grow, restrictions tighten, reputation enters the equation. The startups that endure understand this progression. They treat early signals seriously, responding with cooperation rather than defensiveness. This posture often determines whether regulators see a company as a partner in compliance or a target for discipline. Another lesson the literature returns to repeatedly is that regulation is rarely uniform. Enforcement priorities shift with politics, public pressure, and high-profile failures. Smart founders monitor not just laws, but narratives. What regulators care about now may not be what they cared about last year. Startups that stay attuned to these shifts adapt earlier and at lower cost. Awareness becomes a form of agility. Legal challenges also reshape internal leadership. Founders accustomed to unilateral decision-making must learn deliberation. Risk must be weighed, not dismissed. Counsel must be listened to, not overridden. Books show that founders who treat legal advice as an obstacle often isolate themselves. Those who treat it as strategic input grow into more effective leaders. Maturity, in this context, is the ability to balance ambition with responsibility. As companies enter regulated markets, finance, healthcare, education, energy, the stakes rise further. Here, compliance is not a checkbox. It is the price of admission. Startups that succeed in these spaces often gain defensibility others cannot replicate. The books highlight this paradox. The more regulated the industry, the greater the reward for those who master it. Legal complexity becomes a barrier that protects rather than restricts. Another profound shift occurs in public trust. Customers increasingly expect companies to handle data, money, and safety responsibly. Legal failures are no longer quiet, they are viral. Startups that navigate regulation well earn trust that marketing cannot buy. They are seen as legitimate. This legitimacy attracts enterprise customers, institutional investors, and long-term partners. Regulation, handled well, becomes a credibility engine. Eventually, the most successful startups reach a point where legal systems fade into the background, not because regulation disappears, but because compliance is embedded. Processes run smoothly. Risks are flagged early. Growth no longer triggers panic. The company moves with confidence because it understands the rules of the terrain it operates in. This calm is the real payoff of early discipline. This is the deeper conclusion the books arrive at. Regulation does not slow great startups. It shapes them. It forces clarity, accountability, and foresight. Companies that embrace this shaping become stronger, not weaker. They grow not just fast, but legitimately. And legitimacy, once earned, compounds quietly. If this story resonated with you, pause and ask yourself one question. If a regulator examined your company tomorrow, what decision from the past would worry you most? That answer is not fear, it is guidance. Share that reflection. And if you want to keep exploring how startups can grow boldly without collapsing under legal weight, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and return. Because the companies that endure are not those that outrun the rules, but those that learn how to move wisely within them.